actually officially address a room full of 1Ls. It's very exciting. So thank you for coming today. I'm Suzanne Aronowitz. We'll be talking today about preparing effective job applications for legal employers. I'm curious, how many of you have ever written a resume? Okay. How many of you have written cover letters? How many of you have ever been in a situation where you are making the hiring decisions and you've had to look at candidates' application materials? Okay, so some of you. That actually is a very helpful experience to have, and I encourage you as you start putting yourself out there on the market for internships and jobs to remember what it felt like when you were looking at applications. I'm curious if any of you who were in that hiring position can share with us what was effective. You know, how did you, if an applicant did a good job, how did you know?
My big thing on the cover letter and the resume was I immediately disregarded it once I saw a typo or a spelling error or anything like that. Because, you know, if they weren't taking the time to make sure it was done well, then they probably, you know, might not have that much attention to detail in the job.
Right, so if you saw an error in a one-page best foot forward, you might question the applicant's ability to pay attention to detail, to take their responsibilities seriously, and so you would question their effectiveness. Great, thank you. Yeah.
It's also concerning when they're not concise, so they go over and it's just too much, and then I'm kind of just wondering on what they really felt the main focus or factors of like their last job or last position in like an organization.
Okay, so if their materials were not concise, unfocused, kind of kitchen sink approach, it really was hard to evaluate what was relevant in their background that would make them a good candidate for this job. Thank you. Okay, any other? Yeah.
In the cover letter, I was looking for passion. Everyone's smart. Passion makes a difference. And then in resumes, I was looking for relevant metrics so we could see what they accomplished. They're very short. She said concise, but I want to see numbers.
Great, so you differentiated from the resume, you were looking for metrics and evidence of past performance, and in the cover letter, looking for passion and interest. So that's great, we'll talk about that.
When they can translate their skills, whether it's a cover letter and the resume pertaining to the job they're applying for, even if the jobs they had before didn't have exactly to do with what they're looking for, but they can still translate that. It's good.
Great, so effective job seekers did a good job of translating experience, maybe especially if it was from a different industry or different area, that they were able to show that these skills would make sense here. So I think that is all great. All of those observations that you had from your own hiring experience are true here. Sometimes though, when we're in the midst of applying for jobs, we forget all that knowledge and expertise that we've developed. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about how to be effective with your applications and to really keep in mind your audience. You know, you're not just writing these letters and sending them off into the void. You're intending that a human being will actually read them. And that human being has some very particular goals in this process. And so the more you understand that, remind yourself of that, the more effective you'll be in the process. Today we'll be talking about 5 documents that you will all need. Some of these are going to be very familiar to you. Some of these, maybe this is the first time you've developed these documents. So we'll be talking primarily about resumes and cover letters. And we will also talk about a little bit about writing samples, reference lists, and everybody's favorite, a transcript. So we'll talk a little bit and give you a sense of what employers are expecting from you if they request those documents. So let's get started, and we mentioned it's important to really understand what it is that the employer is looking for. And sometimes 1Ls feel a little bit disadvantaged if they haven't had any legal experience, and they think, I don't know what legal employers are looking for. But I think it's the same things you all have already talked about. So they're looking to assess, can you do the job? Do you have those skills, those transferable skills, that if you show up in their office and they give you a pile of work, you will actually complete the work and do a pretty good job at it. Okay, so they're looking for those qualifications. They are also looking for that motivation. You know, will you do the job? Some of the work we do is not that interesting. Maybe it's tedious, maybe it's complicated. So they want to know that you have the wherewithal to stick it out and to work hard and get the job done regardless of what is being asked of you to do. And then they're also looking for this intangible fit, you know? Are you a good fit for our organization? Are we going to get along well? Do we share values? Is this job consistent with your career goals? You know, if we make you an offer, are you actually going to show up and stick it out for the whole time and really, this is going to be a good relationship for both of us? That's really what it boils down to, these three qualities, or these three questions. Now, legal employers are not expecting that you have prior experience. So don't worry if you've never worked in a legal environment, you have no work experience at all, it doesn't matter. They know that you are getting trained here in this first year of law school, and that's primarily the skill set they're looking for. And we can talk about additional skills that might make you marketable. But don't worry, they know that you came here to get legal experience. So for this first position at least, that motivation and the fit become very important, and your ability to communicate that becomes very important. As you progress in law school, they are expecting that you have been developing a skill set and that you have something to show for yourself. And so by your second, third, fourth internship, the skills that you're getting on the job become much more important. But this first one, you know, really the motivation and fit become more important. So we're going to talk first about the resume. And I want to sort of give you a sense of what's different about resumes and cover letters. Resumes tend to be sort of historical records. You know, they're looking backwards at what you've already done. So it tends to be very fact-based, focused on things you've done, where you went to school, accomplishments you had there, where you worked, and the skills and responsibilities you developed there. The focus of this document is entirely on you. Right? Your name is at the top of the page. It's all a record of your professional and academic background. And so this really addresses that first element, the qualifications piece. So you talked about metrics, and that's kind of what it's looking for. Do you have the skills? What have you done? Very basic in that sense. It's hard to communicate passion in a resume. It's possible, and maybe the kinds of jobs and volunteer work you've done in the past might offer some evidence of your passion, but not always. And so it's a little bit harder to address those other issues on the resume. And by contrast, a cover letter is really asking why. You know, why should this employer hire you? And why are you even interested in this employer in the first place? So this becomes more of a dialogue between you, well, sort of a dialogue between you and the employer, except really you're the only one speaking at this moment. But you're trying to sketch out for the employer why you're writing to them, what you have in common, why it makes sense not only for you to apply, but for them to consider you. And so it gives you a chance to discuss not only your qualifications, but also your motivation and your fit. Okay? This, you have an opportunity to paint a picture of the future and where you're going with your legal career and how this particular position lines up with those goals. So those are very distinct differences, and you might use some of the same information on both documents, but you're going to use it in different ways. So before you get started, because many of us have that paralysis, you look at the blank computer screen hoping your document will just magically appear, beautifully formatted, and that can be a little intimidating. So, I typically start with some lists, do a little inventory of where you went to school and where you worked and what did you do there and when did you get those awards and when did you get those promotions, and try to get all that data down and kind of develop an outline with that information. And then you want to start thinking about evidence and anecdotes. So when I mean evidence, I don't mean that class you take as 2Ls. What I mean is evidence, proof. If employers are looking to see that you have certain skills or certain interests or certain knowledge, what proof do you have of that? And can you even think of little anecdotes of what you did in your prior jobs or what you did in college that might make this more tangible? We can all say we're good at research, we're all good at writing, but it's another thing to show it and to have some examples that you can offer to employers that show you using those skills in action. So you might make some notes to yourself at the different jobs you've worked at, or internships, or at school. Where did you develop these things? What little anecdotes might you be able to share, either in your documents or later at an interview, to demonstrate that you have that background. We talked here about transferable knowledge, and someone mentioned that earlier. really all that means is taking, what you learned before and figuring out how to repurpose that information or those skills for the benefit of this organization. Okay, we didn't erase your brains when you came to law school. So whatever you're learning here is building upon what you already know, and you don't want to leave that other stuff behind. You want to bring it along, but you just need to help employers understand it, because maybe the way it was talked about in your prior industry is something that lawyers won't relate to. And so you need to figure out how to translate that a little bit. Okay, so resumes, full of tips. I'm going to give you some do's and do nots. We're going to actually start with the do nots. Do not use there's usually a resume wizard in your word processing software. I don't recommend using it. The formatting is very ugly. It doesn't tend to highlight what legal employers are interested in seeing. It doesn't give you the flexibility to manipulate the information on the page. If you know how to do tab and bold and italics, that's really all the graphic design you need. Okay, now there are elements of a resume that might be very common in other industries, but they are not typically used on legal resumes. And so any of these, objective, a summary, you don't typically see that on a legal resume. Instead, you would use your cover letter to be very direct with this particular organization about your objective and what your qualifications are. You don't need to say references are available upon request. They know that's true. They know if you refuse to give them references, they probably won't hire you. So you don't really need to say it. We typically start the resume with college. So certainly when you earned your bachelor's and anything after that should be recorded on your resume. If you had interesting jobs and internships during college, those are fair game as well. Typically we wouldn't put stuff from high school unless it is extremely unusual and strategically makes sense to put on there, but in most cases, probably not. And you do want to be careful about translating industry jargon. Make sure that somebody who is not from your prior industry understands what you're talking about. On your resume, you don't use any pronouns. So you don't use the word I or me or my. You are the implied subject of every sentence on the resume. And so it's a little bit awkward. We'll talk about starting your sentences with verbs. So if that feels weird, you can just pretend there's an I there. It's just not written on the page. Every sentence is about you. Okay, so here are some of the things you should do. The general rule of thumb is that resume should be one page. This is not a hard and fast rule. You will not be fined if you submit a 2-page resume. But in most cases, for an entry-level 1L internship, 1 page is sufficient. If you have, there are a couple exceptions. So if you have a science background and you are applying for patent law positions where they really want a more traditional curriculum vitae with all your lab work and research work and all that sort of stuff, a longer resume is much more appropriate in that case. If you're applying for a public interest position and you have a lot of community service and volunteer work, particularly with the population you're trying to serve now, it might be effective to have a longer resume. But we talked earlier about being concise, and that's really important, especially as you start submitting applications to job fairs, where they may be getting a PDF with 50 students and their applications, and they have to go through those very quickly to determine who they want to interview. You don't want to have lots and lots of information for them to sift through. It's really important to be accurate with the way you present your credentials. I'm going to harp on this over and over again. There is no rounding. If you do any rounding, it's against your self-interest. So we'll talk about GPAs, and you don't yet have class rank, but this is something to pay attention to. But everything has to be precise. You should assume that employers will do background checks or reference checks on you, that they could call our registrar's office, your undergraduate registrar, any past employer, and say, it says here on her resume that she earned this GPA, is that true? And if they say anything but yes, you're in trouble. So I would really just be conservative, be precise. This also becomes an issue for the state bar and getting licensed. And so if there is a pattern of these, oops, I made a mistake in the way I presented my credentials, that can become an issue for you down the road. So I just want you to all be very careful. Take the time now to get it right. On a lighter note,